some of you may have been here nearly to 1 year ago. I think it was end of July last year, when we had the initial introductory lecture of Dr. Marcus Kolen, who's a psychoanalyst, a Lacanian psychoanalyst, on the issues of sound and trauma. And together with Ostap Manayuk and a composition, it was a really fabulous evening. And so we continue nearly a year later this evening. I'm very happy to introduce Professor Ina Blom, who is a very close colleague and friend, but also a very outstanding art figure in the art world. She is a professor in the Department of Philosophy, Classics, History of Art and Ideas at the University of Oslo, and visiting professor in the Department of Art History at the University of Chicago. And this is one of her recent books, Houses to Die In, and other essays. It's a collection of essays of Ina Blom's over the course of the last 2 decades. I might also say that she's a contributing writer to Art Forum, and other books of in the past years have also included The Cut Through Time, a version of the Dada, Neo-Dada repetition, The Name of the Game, Ray Johnson's Postal Performance, On the Style Site, Art, Sociability, and Media Culture. And there are many other publications, numerous publications and essays Ina has been involved in, and also her focus has been in media aesthetics. I'm very, very happy to have Ina tonight speak on the subject of straight lines and infrastructural sensibilities. Ina, welcome.
Well, thank you so much, Marta, and thank you, Zvuku, for having me here. It's been a great pleasure to be part of this project this whole weekend, and I've learned so much, and it's really humbling, and it's a great honor to be here. And yes, I'll try to remember to keep the microphone very close to my mouth. I was just saying thank you, thank you, thank you to everyone involved in organizing all of this. And yes, my topic is straight lines and infrastructural sensibilities, but more closely after some consideration on straight lines and the question of following. And I just want to say that my wonderful translator here has done a lot of work translating the entire lecture in case there should be people needing translation. So for any of you who might find aspects of this, unclear or whatever, there is a written translation that I think can be distributed after the fact to anyone who might need it or want to see it. So I want to present in this lecture some thoughts on the question of following, and which is, of course, a key term today in the age of social media, social networks, and networking, technical networking in general. So to follow today, it's not just to be connected for constant updating, it's also to be implicitly aligned with certain mechanisms and sensibilities, and to be continuously registered and counted as such, with all of the feedback effects that such registration entails today. So following points, in other words, to the economic and aesthetic dimensions of contemporary infrastructure. And this is why I, as an art historian, I've taken an interest in a series of 20th century works of art that seem to both, in a sense, prehend, anticipate, and also explore these infrastructural developments and their existential dimensions. And as it happens, and this may be the strange part of the story, these works all revolve around a single simplistic figure, notably a continuous straight line that just goes on and on and on. So, straight lines and art, complex topic. The human hand cannot draw a straight line, John Ruskin wrote in the mid-19th century. No matter how well trained you are as a draftsman or draftswoman, it will inevitably produce curvature or a variety of direction, he wrote. And I was reminded of this statement in connection with the work by the minimalist composer and musical performer Lama Diang. He had a kind of paradigmatic composition that was called, it was composition number 10, 1960, part of a series. And this composition was called just Draw a Straight Line and Follow It. And there's also a variety of associated work that kind of spring from this composition or a proposition, if you want, that extend from musical composition to film, video, and numerous other media. For Young's earliest performances of this work in 1961 shows his awareness of the work's challenge for human bodies. So, like any good construction worker, he was using plumb lines to make the lines which he kind of drew directly on the floor as straight as possible for hours on end. So he needed kind of architectural or building tools in order to create these straight lines. So if the composition called for drawing, his own hand was clearly not up to the task. And this recourse to technical aids may, of course, also have been a sign of the way in which the concept of drawing here has less to do with the work of the hand than with techno-mathematical operations. For instance, of the new media technologies that were not just invading artistic practice around 1960, but were also increasingly understood as key infrastructure of late industrial modernity. Because these technologies, and I'm speaking here of electronic technologies, the beginning of computing, etc., they engage not just our perceptual and cognitive faculties, but also our sub-perceptual and affective, emotional levels of existence. So these days, as I'm sure you all know, we are in so many ways sensorially aligned with technical infrastructure. Technical infrastructure and sensing go together. So on the one hand, such sensory alignment is invested in a wholly new type of interest in common sense. That was a big topic around 1959, 1960. And it was an interest that was first formulated actually at the same time as Lama Diang was developing his reconceptualization of music by these new experts in the field of what they started to call artificial intelligence. So this guy called John McCarthy, he developed his so-called advice taker program in 1958. And this was an effort to establish a logical and mathematical foundation for what he called common sense reasoning. And with the work of Marvin Minsky, which is probably more familiar to many of you, so-called common sense computing became a field dedicated to technically replicating the complexity and ambiguity of implicitly shared knowledge and experience, the kind of things we all intuitively agree on, so to speak. So as to develop machines that may realistically communicate with living, sensing humans. And the key problem, of course, is how to give artificial intelligence a kind of sensory and psychological dimensions that humans have to produce emotional, affective forms of knowledge. And the industrial aims of this project are clearly formulated in the recent advances in the production of robots for the service industry. So let's look at one of those.
Erica listens through an array of microphones hidden in the flower pot. Hello, 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 hello. And relies on electronics and sensors for her movement, and AI software for her responses. Hiroshi thinks Erica lives up to the term sonzaikan, which means she emits something akin to a human presence.
So this is a mathematical sensory body, as you can see, designed to interact emotionally with all of us. So, but on the other hand, I mean, such alignment of sense data, or the technical production of common sense, if you will, is complicated by the way in which the operations of computational media, as Mark Hansen, among others, explain it, they expose us to a sort of expansive domain of non-human sensing, sensibilities that cannot be reduced to kind of defined acts of feeling, sensing, perceiving, or thinking, however complex or ambiguous. So the technical production of common sensing that can communicate with us is, so to speak, doubled up in our real-time engagement and real-life engagement with digital machines by a sort of acute intuition of the power and actuality of unformatted sensibilities, modes of sensing that are not contained by any given form of subjectivity or interaction that can be defined by us, so to speak. So today we are surrounded by sensing technologies on so many levels. You know, many of you know that our current media systems, they evolve from early development of weapon systems and also of researchers in neurophysiology. So, and these such sensors, they're used for absolutely everything having to do with governing and steering and interpreting our environment on so many levels. So my suggestion, therefore, is that the emphasis on not just straight lines in Lamotte-Young's composition, but straight lines and following may, among other things, be a symptom of the critically pressing actuality and complexity of technically synchronized sensing and the strange new existential conditions that they produce. So the topic for this lecture, my topic, what fascinates me, is in a certain sense the question of not just being surrounded by infrastructure, but being infrastructure at many different levels. So now we're coming to part 2. We're going back in history. So on the face of it, John Ruskin, I'm sorry, I have to see what's, yeah. John Ruskin was right. The straight line seems to exclude the body. And if, as anthropologist Tim Ingold has pointed out, modernity privileges the straight line, kind of setting it apart from all other lines, so it is almost like a moral condition of modernity, it's because it is associated with rational, scientific thought and behavior, a capacity for thinking that sets humans apart from animals, one of these big topics of modernity. And with this in mind, it was really fascinating for me to read the writings of Jugendstil architect August Endel and his celebration of the straight line in a text called The Beauty of Form and Decorative Art. Because in this text from 1897, he is not concerned with rational thought. He's concerned with what he calls the immediate power of form upon the mind. That is the ability of form, and more specifically for him, architectural form, to produce instant feelings or empathies, kind of unhampered by narratives or meaning or historical memory or things like that. He's interested in architecture that speaks directly to the senses, a sort of atmospheric architecture, if you want. He wants it to architecture to have an immediate psychological effect on you. And at the outset, of course, August Endel's architecture may have been heavily centered on the capacity of curving lines to construct such emotional responses. Seen, for instance, in his very famous Atelier Elvira in Munich, the atelier for a couple of women photographers, or in the pointillistic patterns in the ceiling of the Volkswagen Theater in Berlin. And through these curving lines and these pointillistic patterns, he sought to kind of directly stimulate the nervous apparatus of people entering the room, to kind of activate, as he put it, the body's expressive muscles. Yet already in this text in 1897, The Beauty of Form, it's above all the straight line the line that always looks the same, that always retains the same direction in our field of vision, that he says has such psychophysiological power. So the line that the human hand cannot draw, that has nothing to do with the human body, supposedly, is, in other words, not just associated with mathematics and with scientific reason, but also with aesthetics, with bodily sensation. And this, according to August Endel, is due to its ability to evoke speed. The basic sense of movement that, as he puts it, is key to all emotion, being moved emotionally. And he explains it this way: if you follow a curving line, you kind of have to be conscious because it's going this way and that. So you have to follow it cognitively. Even though it can have an emotional response, but you always have to have your cognition with it. With a straight line, you don't need that because there's no changing of direction. It goes straight to the brain, as he puts it. So it doesn't need attention. So the straighter and narrower the line, the speedier it is, and the more direct its mobilization of affect or its stimulation of the nervous system. So in contrast to the curved line, it seems to completely bypass perception and cognition and appeal directly to the senses. And so we explored this for the first time in these famous courtyard buildings in Berlin, the Heckische Höfe. Many of you may have been there already and seen these. However, Endel's perspective is only apparently at odds with Ingo's emphasis on the scientific rationality of straight lines in modernity. Because Endel's claim in this same text, The Beauty of Form, that all sensation are only tempo and tension, and that there is a certain tempo for every emotion and a corresponding degree of psychic exertion, if you want, is in fact what he calls a metrics of experience. He made a whole diagram of this kind of metrics of experience that actually blurs the usual hard distinction between qualities and quantities and between inner experience and the outer world. So it's all, a matter of, forces, whether it's out in the physical world or within or, emotional apparatus. Now, the straight line, as you all know, of course, is generally associated with future-oriented modernity. And given its central role in modern art and design, it could arguably be understood as the paradigmatic figure of the industrial age. Yet, Lamonti-Young's draw a straight line and follow it signals for all that a significant shift in emphasis. Because Young doesn't just use straight lines in his work. Through his work, he raises the very question of the straight line to a principle in a way that actually echoes August Endel's idea and its significant context, which is late 19th century interest in what they called physiological aesthetics. So this was a kind of a form of aesthetic theory that was inspired, among other things, by Gustav Theodor Fechner's science of psychophysics, notably the study of how matter relates to mind, how measurable physical stimuli relates to sense experience. So at the from the middle of the 19th century onward, there were all of these apparatuses constructed in order to measure, neuronal responses, to mathematize the sensory apparatus, if you will. And importantly, Lamonti-Young starts to work with these things at the beginning of the 1960s. In other words, in close conjunction with the expansion of performative, situational, and multimedial aesthetic practices that have more or less come to define the institution of modern contemporary art that we know today. So if straight lines at one point seem to symbolize modern industrial style progress, they could also be seen to play a central role in a very, very different approach to social, political, and aesthetic modernity. And what is at stake in this shift is precisely the relationship between the techno-mathematical realm of straight lines and the capacities and temporalities of the feeling, sensing body. So let's move a little bit further ahead in time here. Lamont's line work, his composition, his proposition, became paradigmatic quite quickly. And the speed with which the promotion of linear continuity and also the idea of causality, just follow the line, caught on in post-war avant-garde art, in particularly the New York and European context, says something about the growing alignment with these new infrastructural media realities. So sometimes in the early 60s, the German artist Adi Köpke wrote that the only relevant artistic response to Kazimir Malevich's 1915 black square painting, the icon of abstraction, as you know, was a vertical straight line. And following this idea about the principle of linearity, he used the command line continue as the organizing principle of large sections of his work for many, many years. And around this time, Lamont's straight line also started to migrate kind of indiscriminately between technologies, formats, and contexts, scooping up film, sound, television, performance, word-based score, behavioral patterns, etc., along the way. So there were, for instance, Nam June Paik's 1962 work, Zen for Head, in which he dipped his hair in ink in order to paint a straight line on a long paper skull on the floor, as well as his 1963 Zen for TV, where he had tweaked the internal mechanisms of a TV apparatus so that the screen would only show a vertical straight line. Or Jackson McLow's 1961 script for a movie in which a still camera films the tree for an indefinite time span, so that the resulting film would simply be a kind of continuous line of single image points, proving little to no variation. And actually, a number of the short film works that were commissioned in 1966 by the Fluxus movement impresario George Maciunas seems to conflate film itself with straight lines and issues of measure, speed, and duration. So his own contribution presents film as a sort of a ruler, according to Ruskin, the only means by which the human hand can draw a straight line. So the film is called just 10 feet, and it contains so simply 10 feet or 120 inches of celluloid, corresponding to a mere blip in viewing time. You will soon have seen the entire film. Well, I know you have. So film was, in other words, tantamount to sheer metrics and a barely perceptible duration. And in keeping with this perspective, Eric Anderson's Opus 74 version 2 was simply an arrangement of 74 individual frames that were subjected to speed modulation. You can see the apparatus there that they used for this speed modulation. And the idea was that the film could be projected or drawn, as he said, at any speed whatsoever. And at the highest speed, it would just become a single gray line. So each of these works seem to align technical features with bodily realities. And if they tend to come across as both banal and boring and also somewhat embarrassing or painful, it's perhaps because the bodies evoked here are defined through features that are at once smaller and larger than the type of more anthropomorphic presences that you would have in a lot of performance and body art at that time. Now, August Dendel, when he was thinking about the bodies that would respond to his architecture, he was already thinking in terms of a sort of dissipated architectural subject whose consciousness, bodily present, would not, so to speak, exist prior to its interactions with its surroundings. It would, so to speak, be a kind of an entity that melded with the architecture. And these early works related to the Fluxus movement equally seem to suggest bodily existence at the intersection of multiple scales. So post-war cybernetic culture and all of its theories of body-machine coupling may of course have reinforced fantasies about such scalable modes of bodily existence, as if in preparation for the way in which today's electronic infrastructures facilitate this kind of flexible interaction between macro scale and micro scale elements, such as, for instance, fiber optical networks, computer protocols, and subconscious user habits. So we're all operating at all of these scales today. And in this context, as I'm sure you know all too well, the question of perception and attention control constantly surfaces. So in Paul Celan's Word movie, a flicker film inspired by research on the psychedelic effects of stroboscopic light on the mind, I mean, this is one of the aspects of this film. But more specifically, this film presents the straight line of Western left to right reading as a sort of hallucinatory production of visual oral associations. I've cut the sound here because we can't go into all of that now. But it exposes the kind of the inevitable bodily processing of any written text. So the long straight lines of print technologies are now imbued with speed, evoking not just the sensorial effectiveness of the straight line, but also the troubled issue of the speeds of sensation, which was also always an important issue in the modern efforts to regulate and control perception and attention among school children and students, for instance. And similar intuitions, I think, underpin the so-called reading work pieces by Adi Köpke. These are works that foreground the linearity and continuity of reading, but once again, reading is defined in terms of constant interruption and speedy linear continuity, kind of sensory stimuli only, not what you read. And the continuity of lines is underscored precisely through all of these skips and jumps and repetitions that they produce. So on the one hand, they might seem to recapture this discovery that was made in the 1870s, that the eye that is reading doesn't just move in a linear fashion across the page. It traverses the page in a kind of scanning, saccadic manner. And this is the kind of manner that was actually recaptured when Paul Nitko in 1898, invented his so-called electrical telescope, which is also known as the invention that made television and television scanning possible. And on the other hand, of course, these lines are essentially the lived reality of the perennially distracted, exhausted subject of information overflow, for whom the effort to follow a text produces nothing but hallucinatory flickering. We all know this, reading for exams, for instance. So the difficulties of drawing a line is one thing, but as both August Endel and Lamontian knew, the question of following it is just as important. So now we're getting to point 3 here. So to get a better grasp of what is going on here, we must return to Lamontian's draw a straight line and follow it, paying closer attention to the score and its performative potential. And one detail in particular is worth noting, and I was very surprised. I found this in a letter that he wrote to the composer David Tudor. So Young made sure that moving along the floor, drawing these lines, the person drawing would take care to always stay behind the piece of chalk, so as to automatically follow the line when drawing. You know, when you draw, normally you kind of take the pen and then the line kind of, comes after you. And then if you want to follow the line, you have to go back and then. But if you put the pen like this, I tried, and you just go ahead like this, then you're drawing and following in the same movement. So this Young asserted in this letter was how he originally thought of the piece, drawing and following taking place more or less in the same act. So there's this kind of curious conflation of movements that is implied in this idea, complicating the more obvious ways in which straight lines might suggest following. Now, when discussing straight lines and modernity and the specific realities that straight lines produce in modernity, Tim Ingold identified two paradigmatic types of line functions, notably guidelines and plot lines. So guidelines are typically the hidden or half visible ruler lines used to keep handwriting on the straight and narrow. And from a wider perspective, they serve to produce sort of the blank surfaces of modernity on which any kind of inscription is possible. And in contrast, plot lines are the sort of diagrammatic lines that are drawn up between two or more points or positions. And they make up the assembly that is laid out on the blank surface prepared by the guidelines. So typically, guidelines are the invisible foundations for a more visible action or narrative. So in many ways, they may be compared with all sorts of invisible, hidden infrastructures. But in this analysis, musical scores hold a special position in that they display both guidelines, notably the rule staves, that establish a space for the determination of pitch and tempo, and plot lines, notably the positioning of the notes and their interrelation. So a musical score displays both the general infrastructural framework and the specific plot or organization of materials that it supports. So what is interesting then and peculiar about La Monte-Young's straight line score and associated scores is that it collapses any meaningful distinction between guidelines and plot lines. The straight line is all at once a neutral blank foundation filled with sheer possibility and the specific content of the composition. So Draw a Straight Line is therefore a work that doesn't just display its infrastructural framework, but it really promotes infrastructural sensibility as one of its key modes. So a question again, what type of infrastructures? And another work by La Monte-Young, also made in 1960, all of these works belong to the same series. So this is Composition 1960, number 7, presents us with a single chord, a single fifth, which is supposed to be held for a long time. And this work might provide a clue. We can just look at it and listen to one of its interpretations. So what you're hearing here is, it's not exactly this composition, but it's another one of La Monte-Young's works where you have, a cluster of tones, in this case produced by sine wave generators, and they go on forever and ever and ever and ever. And I think I'm going to cut the sound here. You can listen to this work online. It exists on YouTube, but you can also, if you happen to be in New York, and I think also it exists in Munich actually, there is one of these rooms where this sound cluster goes on forever and ever. And what happens to you when you experience these works, they have an incredibly strong psychoacoustic effect. So you come into the room, in the beginning you hear just this one cluster of tones. It's extremely loud. But then as you move around the room, you start actually listening to your own brain. Because what happens is that, the reverberation of the sound off the walls and in your individual ear would constantly produce new type of sonic experiences. So the sound is all at once just your brain, and it's, sine waves. And sine waves, by the way, are drawings. sine waves are produced, as a graphic straight line in a machine, and they are, so it's one of these sounds that are actually produced by a technical drawing. So the drawing doesn't represent the sound is produced by a graphic production in a machine. So that's interesting to know here. But anyway, this work could be understood to fully embrace ultra-rational mathematical determinacy and precision, because Young's durational exploration of single sounds going on forever and ever were based on a principle that is known in music as just intonation, meaning that it's not based on the harmonic scales that you can use in music, for instance, the pentatonic scale in certain forms of Asian music, or the 12-tone system that we have in Western classical music, but just on precise mathematically defined frequencies, in his case, often derived from prime numbers. So this is very important, because his reason for working with so-called just intonation was that it made exact repetition possible. And the reasoning was like this, that since intervals from the system of rational numbers are the only ones that can be repeatedly tuned exactly, they are the only intervals that have the potential to sound exactly the same on repeated hearing. So now you can forget about the well-trained ear or so-called perfect pitch, etc. Here is really the sonic corollary to the straight line that cannot possibly be drawn by the human hand. And Young's stated reason for choosing the sound that permits such exact repeatability echoes Endel's argument for the straight line. Because such sounds will continually trigger a specific set of auditory neurons in the brain, they will continuously transmit a periodic pattern of impulses that correspond to a set of fixed points in the cerebral cortex. Now, I don't know if this is sound, neuronal science or not, but this is his argument for it, and I think this is what matters. So his idea is that these sounds are programming the brain for stronger emotional affective impact. They're, so to speak, direct sensory modulators. So this encounter with the mathematical ultra-rationality of sound is thus also bypassing the idea of a rational cognitive self and opening up a sort of mobile psychoacoustic realm of fantasy and desire. And even more so, such psychoacoustic effects are reinforced through a wider set of infrastructural associations as well that Lamonde-Young made. Because the fundamental that Young actually uses as the basis for his entire harmonic apparatus, it's 7.5 Hertz. This is a downward transposition by 3 octaves from 60 Hertz. And as some of you may know, 60 Hertz is the frequency of the North American electrical grid. So the harmonic range and its emotion modulating effects must, according to Lamonde-Young, always be aligned with a kind of general environmental hum of modern electrified environments. And when he does these compositions or these sound installations in Europe, he changes his harmonic system to be in tune with the electrical grid in Europe. So you will all have this sense of having already learned this type of tension. And you also know, how you're sitting in a completely silent room these days. There's always, when you start to really listen, the kind of hum of electricity somewhere in the background. So the harmonic range and its emotion modulating effects must always be aligned with a general environmental hum of modern electrified environments. And at this point, I think it's worth recalling the historical reference for guidelines and their infrastructural aspects. Back to Ingold, according to him, they derive from the technology of weaving. Plot lines, in contrast, derive from land measuring. And weaving, notably, is a technology that eradicates the distinction between image and material support. Image and infrastructure, they're the same thing in weaving. A fact that explains why many described the super speedy and continuously drawn scan lines of video as a form of weaving. The video image was all infrastructure, all straight lines, and all speed. And composer and video artist Namjoon Paik, whose entire early work with video and TV technology was based on the direct manipulation of scan lines, he saw his most sophisticated instrument for such work, his 1968 video synthesizer, in terms that echo both August Andel and La Monte. To work directly with the frequencies of video signals and scan processes, according to him, was above all to engage with a haptic technology that could be used for direct neuronal stimulation with all sorts of potentially brain-altering effects. In other words, the body caught in the speedy straight lines of modernity is all at once naturally given to measure and calculation, as well as to the incalculable effects of affective or emotional modulation. And this might in fact be the reality between the strange conflation of drawing and following outlined in La Monte's work. The body here is not something that kind of is produced by the infrastructural framework of straight lines, kind of adapting to it as best it can. But it doesn't come before such infrastructure either, kind of formatting infrastructure in squarely human terms. In this case, technological alignment or following is a sort of feedback process, meaning that the body is literally the movement of the straight line and the force it exerts in many different domains.
And we press the button to command the computer to draw a line. It will draw a line from this position where I am now to any subsequent position of my light pen.
So in 1961, Ivan Cirlce created his Sketchpad program. This was a revolutionary human-computer interaction tool that introduced the first graphical user interface ever in computing, allowing the user to work with precise geometric properties in vector-based on-screen drawing. And to watch the early film Sketchpad demonstrations, like the one you just saw a little bit, is to see a line that seems to draw itself instantly and simultaneous with, yet kind of weirdly detached from the movement of the human hand that seems to follow the forward movement of the line rather than actually drawing it. Now, vectors are, of course, the ultimate examples of speedy straight lines, expressing the effectuating power of movement and action. They are, in other words, key elements in the machines that increasingly manage to access and exploit all sorts of sensorial resources. And it's worth noting that in so-called affective computing today, it's a subdiscipline of so-called common sense computing that particularly strives to interact with the ambiguous behaviors of living, feeling humans. A key method is to understand an emotional expression, for instance, a smile disappearing from a face, as a specific vector. So what is referred to as the continuous model in affective computing defines each facial expression as a feature vector in face space. Feature vector in face space. So emotions and affects are, in other words, treated as infrastructure. That is, as distinct constructive frameworks for new modes of social and economic organization. In fact, a reality in which a face is a mathematically defined space containing feature vectors seemed to be prehended in Mieko Shiomi's Disappearing Music for Face, another early 1960s response to La Monte's Draw a Straight Line and Follow It. Because in this film, a narrow smiling mouth in a tight close-up forms a relatively straight line that is horizontally aligned with the screen rectangle. And the only action in this film is the almost imperceptibly slow movement of this mouth line. From a wide smile, it contracts to the shorter dark line of at the center of a closed mouth. And the entire process takes 10 minutes. We won't watch all of that, but you can see the beginning and the end here. So slow motion, which is an example of the famous time axis modulation that media theorists have seen as a key feature of modern media technologies. They transform the fleeting sign of changing emotional states into technically descended linear action. And it's also I think, this work, it's a somewhat chilling analysis, almost avant la lettre, of the smile courses that would become the signature trait of service industry optimization and the ever shorter technical affective feedback loops between service output, customer feelings, and career tracks. Or today, judging or interactions online, smile or no smile, right? So a smile in these contexts that we know so well today is not so much an expression, an emotional expression, as a kind of a mechanized prehension of the immediate future, kind of preemptive capture of microscopic consequences viewed in terms of accumulated large-scale economic effects. So what is at stake here in the story I've been unfolding so far? I think is perhaps best illustrated by comparing it with another early 1960s attempt to draw straight lines, notably the ones that Italian artist Piero Manzoni repeatedly produced on literally miles of paper. Because this to me is a very, very different thing. Here you see the abstractions of traditional industrial capitalism inform every aspect of the work. The human hand, which cannot draw a straight line, is producing one only by subjecting itself to the mechanical grind of a conveyor belt principle. And the product is immediately then whisked away into yet another realm of abstraction, instantly canned, like other identical looking commodities, forever cut off from their makers. As you may know, Piero Manzoni puts these kind of big lines he produced into these big cans that you couldn't open. So here the straight line foregrounds the passive, exhausted bodies, kind of harnessed to the productivist grind of post-war Europe in general, and Italy in particular, it has to be said. Structurally very, very different, I think, from the exploitation of freewheeling mental and emotional capacities in the affective economy that were intuited and I think also, in a sense, eroticized in Lamont Young's work and a lot of the works we've been looking at so far. So Manzoni's work is more closely related to a history that posits a different relation between straight lines, modernity, and common sense. And the art historian Molly Nesbitt has shown how the French school system at the end of the 19th century focused on technical drawing as a key element in the production of a new type of common sense based on an idea of natural and rational subjects. So at this point, this was kind of a reform in French education of male students. And they were all taught technical drawing. And drawing was seen as kind of the language of industry. And the students were taught that everything in the world could be analytically reduced to straight lines. And that these lines, once you knew how to reduce everything to straight lines, they would produce good common sense without recourse to the body, without anything having to do with emotion, etc. So art, drawing had to do with emotions. Straight line drawing had nothing to do with emotions. And so what Molly Nesbitt explores in her research is then the subversive return of the excluded body, the body excluded from this kind of technical drawing, in the provocatively straight lines of Cubist painting, for instance, and also in the kind of erotically charged technical drawings that appear in the work of Marcel Duchamp and Francis Picabia, etc. So all of these approaches are very different from what I'm concerned with. And what I would add to this theory about the kind of the industrial background to these mechanical works is that in these works, the emotional or affective dimension is always approached as if from a distance. It's kind of conceptually aligned with technical devices, kind of provocatively, these machines are erotic, etc., but not really, right? So with infrastructural concerns also that constantly point in the direction of a sort of a sensory presentism, also known as the elusive now time of the avant-garde work. And it's from this perspective that I want to suggest that Lamontian's infrastructural sensitivity constitutes a veritable gear shift. Because in his drawing of straight lines, or his straight lines, they do not just evoke an erotic body that is excluded from modern technic culture. It's part and parcel of a project that both uses and displays such infrastructural affordances in order to enable an actual and continual construction of new realms of sensation and emotion in the work itself. So this is very different from the kind of elusive photographic present time, the kind of now time, that's also the past time, etc., that is generally associated with the work of Duchamp, etc. So Lamontian's present is the present of microtemporal synchronization, what you're subjected to every day when we're online, actually, based on a sort of, I'm sorry, now my thing jumped here a little bit, based on a sort of sub-perceptual alignment with real-time machine processes. And so remember again his emphasis on the way in which certain frequencies are more neuronally efficient than others, and therefore also more emotionally efficient. And this sort of sub-perceptual synchronization is also more, all the more intensely lived due to its intimate nature as well as its dynamic qualities. So its grip on us is not based on kind of external modes of synchronization like clock time or social rituals or even personal habits. So we all know that the first industrial revolution, it standardized and universalized the measuring of time and, created a universal time for all the world. But the machine clocks that work in today's media and information machines, they operate on a sort of open-ended spectrum of temporalities that, are measured from a trillionth of a second and upwards to hours and days, etc. So these are temporalities that really challenge, at the technical level, the very separation between quantitative and qualitative aspects of time. So that's very, very important here. So we are here really at a big remove from these kind of homogenizing industrial age timeframes that were thematized by Charlie Chaplin, for instance, in his Modern Times, or by Siegfried Kracauer in his description of the straight line of de-individuated precision dancing bodies in 1920s popular culture. Alignment with such forms of machine time is rather a question of constant yet discrete innovation. I mean, the durational times of Lamontian's work, I would say, indicating that a living body may be constantly retuned or re-coordinated as a result of its engagement with machine processes that may themselves be understood as sensing, experiencing systems. So Anna Münster's illustrations use a book called Aesthesia of Networks, indicates precisely these networks as, almost like neuronal apparatuses. And Lamontian intuited such issues when, unlike most composers, he refused to relate to sounds only as functions of and for human listening. So he approached sounds a little bit provocatively as distinct sensing beings in their own right. And he demonstrated this with his kind of rhetorical questions of, shouldn't sounds also be able to hear humans? So both sounds and humans are kind of sensory, vibratory apparatuses. And as Mark Hansen points out, digital networks constitute a sort of operational present of sensibility that replicate the temporalities, the very temporalities of human sensing. So his argument is that the famous half-second gap in our brains between the impressions that we receive and our cognitive awareness of those impressions, this temporal gap in our brain that we don't notice, but everything I see right now, it happened half a second ago, right? It's actually exteriorized in the temporal gap in digital machines between data. So making, in a sense, all the information that is generated about our behavior all the time into a form of worldly environmental sensibility that marks a very complex sensory present. So my argument, and now I'm at the end, is that the intensive efforts to grasp sensibility in its living microtemporal present constitutes the technical and economic framework of the contemporary quest for following. And my aim in this lecture has been to see an emergent infrastructural sensibility in art around 1960, and also earlier, and much of it later, as part of an art historical archive of this phenomenon. So sensory infrastructures engage open-ended subperceptual and perceptual domain, whose infinitely flexible forms of temporalization signify the infinite yet very hard to control potential of living matter, that obviously also open up new avenues of misalignment or non-alignment, misfollowing or non-following. We just have to discover that, right? So as a coda to this presentation, I just want to briefly mention a contemporary work of art that seems to me to constitute a sort of allegory of the shifting significance of straight lines and related infrastructural sensibilities in modern art. So the work in question is called Ulysses on the Subway. It's an hour-long 3D film created by Mark Downey and Paul Kaiser. And it's all about the line that is all at once a guideline and a plot line, a technical means and the very content of the work. As the sound of a subway ride that they, recorded in New York, it's digitally transcoded through a number of very complex algorithms into the continual drawing of a dynamic visual spatial line. You have a kind of ghostly memory of modern infrastructures of speed, the straight line of train tracks, among other, and these explicitly then re-emerge as a technology of sensorial alignment or synesthesia. So just to show you very quickly some non-3D, I'm afraid, bits from this. So this is kind of ghostly memories. So I'm sorry without the sound here because we couldn't access all of this. So all taken. But anyway, for me, seeing this 3D film for the entire hour it lasts was a kind of completely addictive tweaking of my nervous system. That was also a visceral reminder of a form of following that we are perhaps only starting to understand. Thank you so much for your attention. And of course, any questions, very welcome. And there might be confusions also. Yes, Antonio.
Thank you so much. It was a very fascinating talk. I also have studied design and some of those principles, so it's there is a lot of resonation of also what one learns of the positivist sort of beliefs of technology And I think that is there that I have some sort of questions and confusion, because like in this conflation of bodily technologies, in which you seem to say that there is still certain resonance which is impossible to contain, you sort of take away the content of that information, which also, like during the 1960s, they looked, there is this tendency to look at the signal more than the content that this signal brings with it. And I think this still is very present in, you know, like social media, for instance, and the following. So I would be curious to hear more, like in this, you know, in your reading, in this juncture that these works bring forward. Maybe, yeah, if you could speak a little bit, if that was sort of part of it.
Yeah, no, I mean it's very clear that these works are about the signal and, you know, its psychophysical effects rather than, you know, humanistic content and these things. Absolutely. So you very rarely have these, you know, political contexts drawn out or made explicit. There's a lot of works, a lot of artists who do that, and I think with great success. But what interested me here was precisely a story that's a bit harder to tell, because it's about things you don't really see, that you can't even really hear, that's in your brain. You don't know if is it you, is it me, is it technology? And I think that this artistic sensitivity to these kind of ineffable phenomena are interesting for many reasons. I mean, a lot of it has to do, I think, and you see that, I mean, this is now, what I'm giving here is a kind of an informational outline of what is now a fully finished book. And a lot of the material in the book is actually, I think, also dealing with paranoia, with various types of trauma, the sensibilities of things that, you know, technologies, infrastructure that are not necessarily beneficial in any way. So I think the political context comes through precisely in this sense of systems that are at once intimate and overpowering. At once, you know about them, but you don't really know how they affect you or why they affect you. And I think, I mean, only my own banal experience with being on social media, first being excited by the connection with friends every day, with colleagues from all over the world, and then I think, like very many, increasingly worried and depressed about the information that is gathered through my smiles or my likes or my tears or, you know, whatever, and how this is massified and exploited and used. And I think these days we have more of a language to speak about these things, but I think that, you know, these artists who were like August Sandel, very close to the early psychophysical experiments that were going on, you know, the fact that we can measure emotional responses in bodies. And this was also, I mean, at the time, there was, I think it was, no, sorry, I forget, but one of these photographers involved in this, I think it was Marie, I'm not sure, suggested that with these readings, you got these lines that came out of that, they could actually be used as musical scores, you know, and later on you find in the work of, oh God, famous 1950s, 1960s Polish composer, please help me. Penderecki, yes. What he does is he creates a composition which is just this siren sound, which is called Threnody to the Victims of Hiroshima. And he is at the time, he is a very young composer, and he has a side job in a hospital in Warsaw. And I'm amazed he was allowed to do that, but he was allowed to connect patients to an electroencephalograph, you know, where you measure brain waves to certain patients while they were listening to his Threnody to the victims of Hiroshima. That created those readings from the electroencephalograph he used as a score for his next composition, which also has this kind of vibratory ongoing. In the beginning of the composition, it's just these straight lines. So this in and out of these medical apparatuses, but then connected to a history of trauma on every level. And also this is important because at the time, in Japan, for instance, there was a big ban on mediating in film, in literature, etc., explicitly the Hiroshima experience, and also a big fantasy in the entire world, and you can see it in so many artistic works at the time, of these radiation in the air, things that affect us that we cannot see, but that are still, impacting us very strongly. So this sense of technologies that are not about content, but that are at once inside and outside our bodies, and that reformat our neuronal apparatus. I think it's one of these big stories of the 20th century. So that is kind of I think the why I'm not focusing on content. So it's a small story, but I think that it has a lot to do with artistic aesthetic sensibility and aesthetics in the 20th century. Yes.
Thank you for your lecture. I have a question regarding aesthetics. I have a very big doubt that all the examples you bring up has a meaning today. I'll tell you why. I mean, all those actions and gestures are dissolved a lot in pop culture, especially Penderecki or the avant-garde from 70s, starting from Young, starting from Lucier, and all the composers we break through 12-tour system is already part of horror movies, commercials. It's not working at all.
No.
Like young generation visiting Lamontian Dream House, some of them feel nothing. Because there is no any rebellion anymore there. There is no any resistance in aesthetic aspect towards of contemporary dynamics. And I think it's amazing on historical level, but for us content of emotional or intellectual experience, it's not working at all. It's like visual minimalism is just a lines and squares for many people, and I don't think it's not working. And that other days they were working because it was shocking in compared to employment of desire coming from the pop industry, from the pleasure where they've been spread out within mass media and stuff. Then you can understand that those sounds going forever is something revolutionary. But today I don't see it working at all. So I was really interested, what's your purpose of bringing it today for the contemporary context? I don't want to be,
No.
Yeah,
I agree with you. I mean, it depends what you mean by working. If you mean working in terms of consciousness raising, I'm sure you're.
in general, like an object of art which is shown to people when it's supposed to reflect somehow. You always recall someone's experience. It doesn't need to be knowledge of all the special my performing practice is completely out of intellectual content at all. It doesn't mean it's not based on intellectual processes. I mean that a lot of consumption, especially minimalism, is not working as it was 60 years ago. There is not something like things are stayed the same for 60 years, and regarding all the frequencies and stuff, especially that our brains are neuroplastic, and tune to whatever actually. If I work with my sound, I tune to my sound so much that I don't bother with others, and you have different ethnic tradition, different part of the world, they are completely out of the welfare system, which is completely oppressive and part of our heritage of imperialism. So it's interesting for me why it's when you use it as a source of narration of your conclusions.
Yeah. No, I mean, I would not presume that these works, that they are having an important political impact today, or I'm not sure they had at the time. But I think, I mean, what I'm interested in is why did these artists produce these works at the time? What were the kind of environments that triggered them to create these works that seemed to be boring, almost invisible, that seem to have to do with brains, etc. And so it's more a sort of, an historical archive of a certain sensibility of something that's banal to us today. Today, because they're all around us, these infrastructures, right? But these were not banal. These are kind of new existential dimensions of the 20th century. And a lot of art is simply kind of, testing your existential framework, right? But I wouldn't make big political claims for this work. And I wouldn't say that they are consciousness raising in any way, or that they would, but I think that if they teach us something, they teach us that technical systems, they are not just something out there. They're also in our bodies. They are working on our bodies. It's a good thing, I think, to be aware of it. And I think it's interesting that there seems to be a kind of an implicit sensibility to the growing importance of this fact in looking back at the 20th century. So it's a kind of a parallel history to the more explicit histories of resistance, of, content-oriented framing of political situations. And it's not for me a question of saying, one thing is important.
I was not criticizing using, let's say, in a really coarse way, abstraction. It's not about that. I'm not reflecting to content which was brought up before. I'm just reflecting to this minimalist construction or the system or combination which are already done as a part of our consciousness of the mass media, whatever it is. So I'm not thinking that abstract work is not political today. I think it's much more political than ever, especially now. Because if you work within any very straight content like languages or political or any social, then you can be even stronger because you can avoid a narration, go straight to the person, and it's different. But it's different thing. I'm just thinking that this post-minimalist is not working, and mostly it's become also part of our bourgeois decoration, especially in context of the music which fulfill the spaces, have good time with that, and then blah blah blah. So that's it, I stop talking.
I'm not going to argue against that.